Engin, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Or like, I don't know if it's an invitation or we co-created this idea talking a few weeks ago, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's also a bit of an experiment for us. So me and Francesca and Senna and the CIID team are super excited to look at this as a pilot, as a way to support each other networks and activities. Today we'll focus on climate adaptation, and Francesca will run an exercise with you all. First, we thought maybe to introduce a bit of CIID and more than anything, like the mindset and our values and our purpose, so that hopefully can not just like show how aligned our two organizations are, but also maybe inspire people in a different way. So CIID is all about learning, strategy, and venturing, and naming that means like we have educational programs, we do more consulting type of work and strategy work with private and public organizations, but we also support like startups and new teams venturing their businesses, and with something called InnoFounder, which is a national incubation platform here in Copenhagen, now attended by more than 45 startups a year. And I was super happy to see that Hez is in the audience here, and Hez was one of our people who started the InnoFounder. So our purpose at CIID is to teach and practice life-centered innovation. We empower individuals and organizations to make positive impact through the design of innovative products, services, and environments that enable better futures for people and the planet in total alignment with the SDGs from the United Nations. Here are our core values. So we believe in life-centered design and innovation, which simply means that we are learning how to put like all the ecosystems, living ecosystems, in the center of our innovation process. For many years, and I guess also our friends at ATÖLYE have done the same, we thought that by being very human-centered, some people call it user-centered, customer-centric, we were doing something great for the quality of life of people and of course for innovation in general. And that's absolutely true. But often that kind of focus on people has come with at a big cost for the environment, meaning that by focusing our decision-making on improving the life of people, we've often created like, pollution and negative impact on the ecosystem of the planet at large. So, and that's also why we have decided to expand in Costa Rica. So right now, CIID is operating in both Copenhagen and Costa Rica as a way to be closer to the narrative of biodiversity, biology, and nature in general. A core activity and value at CIID is prototyping, which is not just intended as a process of making, but it's also intended as a process of creating a common language amongst all the stakeholders who are involved in the innovation process, namely customers, but also anyone involved in the supply chain, in the chain of innovation. So, and now we need to understand how to include nature in that prototyping approach and in that platform. So for us, prototyping is something that you do throughout the process, not just something that happens towards the end. Moving from an industrial kind of revolution approach to prototyping, which really meant like, let's build something when we know everything about what needs to be piloted, versus a way more kind of craft-based approach where we actually start prototyping when we don't know enough about something. So prototyping as a way to ask questions. We believe in an open and distributed innovation, so innovation process which is not just in the hands of a few people, normally controlled by even fewer people in a sort of very secret room, but we believe into open innovation as a way to enable everyone in society to actually be part of that process. And then we try to be an organization that evolves and changes and iterates itself over the years and over the changes happening, and now we're in the middle of a big extraordinary change for all of us. So we have a learning and growth mindset, trying to be the best version of ourselves over the different phases. This is a visualization I personally love about this idea of transiting from being people-centered to life-centered, where basically we move from like a way of putting the people and the mankind at the top of the pyramid in terms of decision-making, and we look more like a biocentrism where everything that has a life is treated as equally in the ecosystem targeted by innovation. And here is still in progress now for maybe too long, but like a little chart that maybe would like to show the meaning of design. Actually, personally, I like to think of design as a sense-making activity. And especially for people who are not from the design field, and I guess like probably some of you today are from there, so that we don't get too intimidated by the word design as associated to something with aesthetics and something that has to be, you know, designed and produced and that has a combination of function and aesthetics at the level of a product or a service. Design is actually an activity that, as to me again, is more about making sense, and it's about building anything like kind of human kind thought and build. And we now see the progression of going from something that was often associated as like building an artifact, especially before the Industrial Revolution. So any kind of tool, from like making a knife or a table or a chair, that's an act of design, which means like making sense of what people need, the technology you have available, the culture in which you're building this new artifact, but also the resources you have available. And normally we associate this idea of design with like a guy like this guy, like a craftsman, getting to know the person, building a table, understanding, making the different prototypes to better understand what is really needed and what really makes sense in the context of that person. And then with the Industrial Revolution, the design became a actually quite separated activity, very associated with the problem solving and not so much with the problem setting, and something also quite associated with a more engineering way of looking at innovation. So in order for the machines to perform and in order for the machines to work, and especially in order to justify the cost of the machine, we needed to know everything about the new product to be produced. That really required a bit more kind of engineering approach to produce new products. So design became a little bit of a kind of designers were more kind of people executing on a brief that often engineers would give us, like, you know, with some design specification, and it was very much associated with making something functioning, but especially something beautiful. All the way to Industrial Revolution again with, the product design as a way to once again industrialize products in big scales. So design is very associated to the product, the shape, with interaction design and with the computers basically, and digital products coming in the context. We also have designers starting designing not just the beautiful products, but also the new behaviors that people would need to adopt to use some products. For example, when computers were, started showing up in our lives, we needed not to just design the physical box, not just like the software functioning, but also how people would actually interact with such a new thing. It's not a typewriter, it's not a television, it's something in between. And so people and designers started thinking and started using the idea of scenarios as a way to really stage new behaviors for people. So it was something still about the product, it was something about the function, but a lot about the behavior. And often we call this experiential design, experience design, something like that. And then in the 90s, we see like this rediscovery, which actually before the Industrial Revolution was completely the normal way of looking at design. The rediscovery that design has something to do with business, that if you adopt really good and strategic design, if you really understand the users and so on, you actually end up with successful business performances. And so this was the phase of, you can name it design thinking, strategic design, design management, you name it, but it's basically thinking of design as a thinking process to change the way you approach the innovation of a new product, but also the way you restructure organization. So it's very much applied to the organizational level. And I think this is what we see today, that from any kind of design consulting or business consulting or public sector, private sector, has now adopted design simply as, like, once again, sense making, or again, design thinking, meaning not just using design as a way to solve the problem, but also and especially to use design to do the problem setting phase of innovation. So design as a way to be creative, not just about the solution, but also about the challenge at hand. And now we see, like, in the last 20 years, the fact that design and sciences have come together, both in terms of like biology and design, but also information sciences and design, all the topics about artificial intelligence, biotech, and so on. And lastly, the responsibility and the breadth of design is going all the way to thinking systemically about the life of the planet and the life of people as humanity. So it's not any longer something that we consider to be an activity within some one shop or some one industry or some one organization, even like a region. Now, with the open and transparency of the data, and with like awareness also about especially the climate and other major challenges that we need to face, design is becoming an activity that can really help us designing new policies, new ways of living in the cities, and really at the systemic level. And that's also where I wanted to show this slide, because I think that's also a way to bridge with what Francesca will do today, to design as a way to rethink like big systems and a big scale level. And so today we wanted to also tell you a little bit about our programs this summer. As everyone, we have quickly, or maybe not everyone, I don't know, but we have done our best to adapt to the ongoing pandemic and the ongoing phase we're all living. And most of our, actually all our educational programs have now been translated into digital programs, so which has created a lot of new opportunities for us, but also especially for the potential audience out there, meaning that it's definitely easier to access and for many people to access this platform and this learning. So it's a program which is based on live instruction, so we don't really have recorded videos or recorded like tutorials. Everything is done like as a digital classroom, as like with the faculty very present and with the participants constantly active. It's a lot still about co-creation and collaborations amongst the participants, and CIID will never give up its our approach to prototyping and making. So even if we're sitting in front of Zoom, people will actually be building stuff, making things, and make sense of their own space to learn by doing. So the program this summer will be like a set of workshops. Each workshop is 5 day long, and we schedule them in from the 13th of July to until mid-August. But also we're planning on some workshops to run then in the more Asia, and specifically the Tokyo time later in November, and also some in the Americas time zone in October. So now we're looking at the world, we're slicing it into time zones rather than like individual cities, which is a quite interesting mindset to have. And each workshop is normally facilitated by 2 visiting faculty from our network, and Gin has been often, or sometimes one of them, and also maximum 20 people in. It's a learning program, but it's not just that, it's also a way to network with people who are coming from maybe different sectors, but in the same way they want to also learn new tools and new skills. And it's also a way to, normally we see that people coming through the education, they find themselves quite transformed by the end of the week, even if it's such a short time. Transform both personally, but also like professionally. I shouldn't maybe say, but many people quit their jobs or like look for new ventures, or go back with some new tools to adopt immediately. Here is a bit of a. I will now. I don't know how much time I have left. Maybe you should tell me. Give me an indication. We have approximately 14 workshops running, 14 workshops this summer. And as I said, it will run for 5 weeks. What's also interesting is that once a week, all the faculty who are part of that week will give a short talk to introduce themselves to the wider audience, and also tell like sometimes a bit more personal stories about their work, and sometimes failures, sometimes successes, but anything that is a bit more informal than the usual kind of conference participation. But also, and especially, we also saw the need for the participants themselves to actually show up on stage and tell a story about their background. And I'll just go quickly. So this summer we have, all these are like 1 week long workshops. The first one is Intro to Interaction Design, which is a foundational program about the basics of interaction design, both from a historical perspective, but also as a process. So you will find yourself probably designing new digital products and new interactions, all the way from not having an idea, but just like a topic or a challenge, all the way to a simple, but still like a performing prototype that shows the learning of the week. People-centered research, actually with Arunima, and sorry, I forgot to say here, is with Matt and Eric, 2 very established interaction designers, also not just professionals, but also people who have been studying the practice for a long time. Arunima and Chan actually being Turkish, will be teaching people-centered research, which is the art of understanding people's needs and desires, and simply understanding in a genuine way the life of people in a given context that you want to innovate. So it's a kind of overcoming the subjective view of the designer or the innovator or the technologist, and really trying to understand the reality from the people's perspective and understand what guides the decision that they make on a daily basis, given a topic, again, mobility, health, or education. Ben and James will teach storytelling strategies and technique, which is like the layer and design in general, because you can have the most wonderful idea, prototype and everything, but you also need to be able to convey and tell the story about such an innovation. Annelie and Francis will basically work on visualizing systems, but not just systems, also data and simulation. So starting from raw data, how do you make sense? How do you go from data to knowledge and meaning by building visualization, simulation, and simply visualizing systems that are hidden or like very intangible when you just look at the data. Sarah and Basil will teach design of services, starting from a data perspective. So most of the services we use the data that is, about like us. So shaping services based on a very kind of very personal profile of the people. But also you could look at that as like shaping services for a city level or for like data coming from bigger crowds. Very interesting process all the way from a service design challenge, like the need to design a new service, all the way to experience prototyping as well and start building some of the touch points of such new services. Service design, more kind of established and more like, I would say, traditional way of designing services. So moving from the idea of designing one artifact, one product, into the idea of designing like the whole like journey of, in terms of place and times of the different touch points that a user is getting into contact with when using a service. And this is taught by Margaret and Diana. Annelie again and Monica, two actually members of the CIID team, will talk about designing ethical future. In the context of innovation, there are different aspects and different items and different practices and knowledges to take into account, from like, again, like the actual design of the artifact, the technology, the ergonomy of the experience we're designing, but also more and more like there is an ethical implication in whatever we design for the future. And this is a way to take into account ethics and start building a foundation of what kind of ethical implications there will be in the innovation that we want to bring to market. And it's a very interesting way to speculate about different scenarios for the future, thinking of ethics. Here we have a combination with Monica and Rebecca of design and biomimicry. We claim that as designers, we want to use prototyping as a process to share a language, to understand how to shape solutions, but effectively, we can look at nature as a big mentor for such a process, because nature actually and the planet have been prototyping ever since, like for almost 4 billion years. So there is nothing in nature that is static. Everything is in constant evolution, and you could look at that as a constant prototype to become the best version of itself. And so this is a way to support innovation process by looking at, once again, nature as a mentor. Quite interesting speculative way of pushing our boundaries as human beings in regards to innovation. And then Alex and Sarah will help us putting design in the context of behavior and impact, meaning looking at design as a way to stimulate and facilitate and actually shape new behaviors which are more inclusive and more like in tune with the context that they're meant for. And I know there will be like an interest this year to possibly focus on the life black matters as a challenge to work on for the class. Mary and Grace, they come from using design as a way to change and transform organizations, so at the managerial level, and they will talk about change management through design. Actually, this will be a class that doesn't happen within 1 week, but it will be spread over 3 weeks with a few hours per week. And this is a way to actually see the actual impact of the learning, because when it's about not really prototyping one product, but it's about changing the way people behave, they really want to give the time to their participants to actually apply in their own organization such a learning. So that's why it's over 3 weeks. Andreas and Jan and Jenny will take us into machine learning for interactive arts. So it will be like a quite artistic eye on machine learning, very much based on prototyping and not much programming background is needed. Design for circular economy with Angela and Arunima, we look at like design as a way to create regenerative systems, not so much from a business perspective, but more really from a service and product perspective. So how can we design products that are kind of regenerating themselves over time? And last, and here I'll pass the word to Francesca, designing for climate adaptation, where design is used as a strategy to actually think of potential futures and help all of us as individuals and organizations to adapt to the reality of the climate and all the consequences that are connected to it. So I'll now pass the word to Francesca. I hope it has been not too much of a long monologue. I hope you got something out of this, but you're most welcome to contact our team or ATÖLYE for like, if you're interested in following our programs. Francesca, the word is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Simona. Thanks for the intro. I think if you stop sharing your screen, I can start sharing.
I think I did.
Okay. All right, let me get my slides up. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. Great, thanks. So as Simona mentioned, I teach along with Kelton Miner this workshop Designing for Climate Adaptation. And we wanted to share a little bit about how we think about this course and then do a workshop exercise together. So that'll be the rest of the talk today. So my co-teacher is normally Kelton Miner. He is a PhD who studies data, behavioral science, and particularly climate adaptation and how people are adapting to changing climates. He just did a large study looking at new behaviors in the Arctic are about changing climates. And myself, I am a designer with CIID, where I will lead projects in the research space or service design space. And I have a background more in sort of large international politics and economics and working in the climate sphere for a number of years before I joined CIID. This is a topic that's also quite close to my heart. Before we dig in, we wanted to share a few key vocabularies. So within like the climate action space, there are two types of actions. There are things that you can do that are more about mitigation, and this is really about reducing the greenhouse gases that we release to the air. So you can think of solar panels as being an action here that you could take, replacing maybe dirtier carbon fuels with cleaner renewable energy. And so those actions are really about mitigating climate and reducing the action in the future. But then the other word that's really important is adaptation. And this is how do we adjust to the actual impacts that we're seeing, because we are already causing climate change. So how do human systems sort of adapt, seek new models? So this is another part of climate action that's really important. An example here that I love is in Myanmar and Bangladesh. Farmers used to farm chickens, but chickens can't swim. So the entire business system is adapting and shifting to grow ducks. And there are all sorts of new businesses that are popping up to sort of like hatch ducks or take care of eggs, grow younger ducks, grow older ducks. And then it's also now starting to change diets because duck wasn't as available. And there were some very specific meals that were duck-based you would only get at certain times of the year, but now there's lots of duck. So there's sort of like these new behaviors and shifting businesses and shifting even diets that are happening because of climate impacts. And so this is the space that I find really interesting as a designer, because climate change is already happening in some parts of the world. We're guaranteed to see some of it coming down. And so thinking about how do we adapt our services, how do we adapt our cities, how do we make ourselves more resilient, becomes a really interesting design question. And this is what the week is really about. I'm going to talk about just a few small things today that are part of our course. One is the uncertainty in the climate crisis, and the role that futures and storytelling can play to help us sort of navigate that uncertainty and be prepared for it. And then we're going to do this exercise, climate fiction prototyping, together, and sort of try out how we use futures and storytelling as a brainstorming technique. All right, so even though we've been studying the climate crisis for decades now, there's still a lot of uncertainty. One of the biggest things we don't know is how much carbon can we put into the atmosphere. So this is a graph of different estimates of our carbon budget. How much CO2 and greenhouse gases can we emit before we hit the 1.5 mark, which scientists have told us is important to stay below. And you can see there's a really wide range of estimates. Some scientists think we've already passed that point. Some scientists say we have another 20 years. So there's a lot of variability in what we can put into the atmosphere. And part of the reason there's this uncertainty is that we also have incomplete models. So one example of this is clouds. Some types of clouds heat up our Earth. Some types of clouds reflect sunlight and keep heat out. But how to model that is actually really difficult. And so we can't quite figure out exactly how our world works. So there's always going to be some type of uncertainty in the science itself. But the biggest uncertainty really comes from the fact that we're talking about the future. We're talking about 2030, 2050, maybe 2090. And of course, none of us really know what that looks like. Even though Corona is a great example, people have been talking about the possibility of a global pandemic for a few years, but we don't know until it hits exactly what that looks like. We can make estimates, but how do you prepare for that? How do you know how governments are going to react or businesses are going to react? There's a lot of uncertainty in our futures. But I think as a designer, that makes it super interesting. When we think about futures, there are a lot of different models we can use or tools. Perhaps some of you have seen this. This is the pretty famous cone of futures. And it sort of says we can go from now into the future, and there's this wide possibility of what that can look like. And we can think about things that are more possible or more probable or more preferable. But when we think about that cone of futures, there's a critique from this man, Cameron Tonkinwise. I'm not going to play his whole clip, because I know there's a bit of a video lag, so I'll try and explain his critique. But he says that we forget that that cone of futures is attached a bit to like a flashlight. That was one of the original drawings. And you can think of that flashlight being attached to a hand. And it's not a linear process. It's not now until the future. You can sort of move your hand around and you can see very different types of cones. Or you can use your flashlight to walk a little further and turn around. And then there's a whole new set of cones that are available. So thinking about like the non-linear aspects of our future and the emergent properties and just how complex it can be, and how even if you're in the dark, you can really choose where you point your flashlight and what type of future projection you're even thinking about. And in the climate space, there are a few different pathways, a few different cones of futures, a few different flashlights that you can think about. And very technically, we call these shared socioeconomic pathways. This is what the IPCC uses to determine all of their scientific sort of projections for where the world is going. And you can think of these as sort of plausible alternative evolutions of society at a global level. So they're thinking really big scale. In our class, we go into these in a little bit more depth and sort of think about the science behind them, but I'll just share sort of the top stories. On the graph, you can see there's challenges for mitigation, so futures where it's very difficult to reduce our impact or easier. And then on the bottom, it's challenges for adaptation. So futures where it's easy to change and deal with climate change, or futures where it's harder. So there's a middle of the road scenario, which is kind of boring. We're going to skip it today. But then there's one future you can think of that's all about sustainability. And in this future, the world gets its act together and really puts an emphasis on human well-being, puts an emphasis on environmental friendly tech and renewable energy. There's investment in renewable energy. There's investment in new types of grids. There's investment in new types of food. And this is happening at a global, regional, and national level. The really organizations, businesses coming together, working together to take us on a more sustainable path. There's another scenario which is called the fossil fuels development. And in this scenario, there's an emphasis on tech and global progress, but it's not necessarily renewable energy. It might be fueled more by energy-intensive lifestyles or fossil fuel, and there's not as much environmental awareness around the world. And so you can think of this example as maybe the one where maybe places build a lot of seawalls and protect their harbors from rising seas. Or maybe we build floating islands, which take a lot of energy, but move people away from areas that might be at risk from flooding. But it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of infrastructure, we have to build new things, and that takes our carbon budget and sort of pushes us into these higher scenarios. The fourth pathway is all about inequality. And in this world, there's a growing divide between the globally connected society and then sort of fragmented lower income societies. So you would see increases in inequality both at the global scale, but also within countries. And in this situation, unrest and conflict becomes more common, and the institutions at a global or regional or national level sort of fall apart and become less effective. And in this scenario, maybe we are able to actually reduce our emissions. Maybe the richer countries get their act together, the richer people transition to, renewable energies and more sustainable ways of living, but they don't bring everybody along. And so there's this growing divide of people who are more exposed, people who aren't in that society. And it's harder to protect those people from rising sea levels or more extreme heat. And then the worst case scenario is all about regional rivalry, where regions sort of break off, and there's an emphasis on national issues, nationalism, how regions respond to conflicts. And you can imagine here that the global trade system sort of breaks apart at this point. Economic development is slow. Regions look to what their own resources are, so they might be looking more to fossil fuel resources in their own spaces, or whatever they have in their own spaces. And again, those global institutions sort of start to crumble, and there's less international trade. So these are the 5 scenarios that the climate scientists are using. And you can see maybe as I've told the stories, there are parts of them that remind you of what you see in the world today. And the idea is that any one of these futures can be possible and is plausible. But they're really broad. They're at a global scale. They're hard to understand. What does that mean for me and my country and my job and my family? So they're a starting point. But what we try and do in our class is really bring them and downscale them into your environment and help you understand sort of like, how do you prepare for any one of these futures if you're a business or a person? And so for that, we really need to use storytelling. And I am a massive climate fiction nerd. I spend a lot of time reading climate fiction, and I've been quite curious about how sort of like authors are tackling this aspect of climate change and anticipating what the world starts to look like. But what does that mean for designers? Can we use similar techniques to think about what we design? And if you are familiar with science fiction, it's had a large influence on the technology that we have today. many types of technology were imagined in books, or even rules for our technology were sort of articulated in science fiction. So there is this really strong connection between the stories that we tell ourselves in the fiction and what we bring into our futures. And storytelling is critical to design. We tell nonfiction stories all the time in our field research, bringing the lives of people we meet to life. This is an image that some of our researchers took talking to women who are using a service that helps them adapt to new weather. So they're farming and they need to know how the droughts are changing or when the floods are coming, and how do they farm across those new weather patterns. And then every time we come up with a concept, it's part of a fiction. It's part of something that hasn't been made yet. This is an image from an architectural project that is one of those floating island projects that some people are trying to build out in the Pacific. And so they've created an entire made up story of what it's going to be like to live on that island once it's finally built. I want to give you just a very quick example of how we've done this in the past then. Last year when we were teaching this workshop, we were in Costa Rica, and we were looking at the issue of heat, particularly in this neighborhood that you can see on the image. I hope there's not too much lag with the video. But the science was saying that there's definitely going to be increased heat days from now until 2099. But you can see there's two parts of the graph where they go really high up, and we're looking at almost 250 new days of heat stress in the capital of Costa Rica. So whereas now there might be a month that's very hot, we'd be looking at 2/3 of the year, if not more, that are very, very hot. But there's also scenarios where maybe it's not as bad. Maybe instead of 250, there's 50 new days. So maybe there's almost 2 new months of heat stress in the city. So we were thinking about that range of heat and exploring the community and talking to people who live there right now. And then our students used stories as a brainstorming exercise to come up with, so they were using stories as brainstorming tools to come up with new concepts or ideas to how to manage that heat. And then they turned them into comics. And so I'll just share a few. This is one, a bit of a dark sort of noir comic about a woman who is able to escape from the hot city into a community and join sort of a small community that was called Recreation. It's a bit of a dark story about how do you sort of get out of the city and sort of find a small community. And then this was another comic that I really enjoyed that was the creation of an office for migrating species. And the idea is that the office would be in charge of sort of welcoming new species as they migrated through the city because their habitats were changing. And it was sort of this underlying story of how do we create open spaces for any species, so in a way that we'd also be willing to welcome maybe humans who are coming in. All right, so now we're going to try it out. So the way that we use these stories, we're calling climate fiction prototyping, and it builds on the work of this futurist David Johnson, and he coined the term science fiction prototyping, where you use science fiction, whether it's like more plays or immersion or film or comics, or what we're going to use today, which is just some writing, to really start to imagine these possible futures. And there are 5 steps. So your first step is you set up your world. You really imagine what is that fictional world that you're anticipating. How has the climate changed? How has the world changed? And then you're going to pick one scientific inflection point. So one moment where there's a change from climate science, or there's a change in how the world is working. And then you're going to think about, okay, what's the change that's what's the ramification? How does your world change? How is the life of your main character changed? And then you're going to think about their inflection point. So what do they do to adapt? What do they do to make their life better? What do they do to manage the change? And then it sort of creates this loop, but the last step is to think about, okay, then what's the impact of that? Sort of these second order changes that you're starting to imagine. All right, so we're going to try it out. And the case that we're going to be working in is fish farming in Turkey. So across the world, aquaculture, this process of growing fish in sort of human-made ponds in the ocean, is the world's fastest growing food sector. And Turkey is the largest producer in the Mediterranean. It's really a key point in the supply chain of fish. You're exporting fish to Europe, but also importing fish food from Africa or Asia. And fish food is sometimes other fishes, but it could also be algae or even sometimes something from like corn or wheat that's grown on land. And in terms of location, it's mostly in the Aegean Sea. Sort of, you will know the area better than I. And then the impacts from the climate crisis are primarily driven because of a warming ocean. So our ocean is becoming warmer with climate change and more acidic as it heats up. And so that affects what kind of fish you can grow. Some species may not be suitable as the water gets warmer, but also they might not grow as big because they have other heat stress on their bodies. And the warmer water also creates opportunities for diseases, new bacteria that survive in these warmer waters. There's also a risk of stronger, longer lasting metacanes, which are Mediterranean hurricanes. And as the climate gets hotter, there's a larger risk that these will destroy infrastructure at a higher scale and be stronger and longer lasting. But you can also think about indirect impacts. So maybe trade is changing because of the way that the climate is influencing. Maybe diet preference is changing. Are people still eating fish? What happens with the fish if people aren't still eating it? So thinking about what are maybe new opportunities for fish farming as well. Imagine. All right. So the first step that everybody needs to do is go to this link, and I'm going to share it in our chat as well. But go ahead and click on that link, and then you should be able to click a button, and everybody should get one of these cards. So hopefully everybody has one potential pathway for your future. I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, and then you're going to combine that future with this story. So you can imagine that you are part of a company that farms fish in the Aegean Sea. And with growing population around the world, fish remains a key source of protein and healthy oils, and fish farming employs thousands of workers. As the climate changes, rising water temperatures make it harder to farm certain species of fish and foster bacteria, which causes illness in the fish. Warmer waters are also creating stronger, longer-lasting hurricanes, which destroy infrastructure. How might we adapt practices and infrastructure to work with rising temperatures over the next century? So this is sort of the first step of the process. This is a bit of your world. And now, with the exercise, you get to write the rest of the story. So think about who's your main character. Are you a fish farmer? Are you a director? Who are you in this world? And then write about that character and sort of follow the steps of prototyping. Think about the inflection of the science, how that affects the world, how your main character adapts, and then what are the implications of that change that you're making. Don't think about how you need to write a really big essay. This is just a short brainstorming exercise. I'm going to give everybody 15 minutes and just write a really simple story. Think about this future world, think about your climate pathway, and have fun kind of brainstorming a story. Does that sound good?